In this lesson, we'll talk about quotation marks, and also, even though it's not a grammatical concept, we'll talk about how to use quotations correctly in writing. First, about quotation marks. We use quotation marks to indicate the exact language of a speaker or writer. So we only use quotation marks when we're actually copying the exact language, not paraphrasing, not summarizing, but using the exact language of a speaker or writer. For example, Benjamin Franklin once said, "Any fool can criticize, condemn, and complain, and most fools do." That is different from paraphrasing or an indirect quotation. You do not use quotation marks for those. And so a paraphrase of that same quotation would look like this. Benjamin Franklin said that most fools tend to criticize and condemn others. You can see how the idea has been reworded a little bit. It's been put into the words of the writer and do not reflect exactly the words of the original speaker, Ben Franklin. So quotation marks are not used. And it's okay to paraphrase and quote someone indirectly. You just do not use quotation marks when doing so. Okay, so when indicating dialogue between two or more individuals, create a new paragraph every time the speaker changes. And so here's an example of what that looks like. I'm not going to go and read the dialogue here, but you can just get a sense of how there's a new line, a new paragraph every time there is a change in speaker in dialogue. Okay, just a quick note on capitalization and direct quotations. You'll want to retain the capitalization that is in the original quotation. So if this quotation here was taken out of something and it was a snippet of that quotation and it was not capitalized, the was not capitalized, you don't want to just capitalize it. You can go ahead and integrate it into the flow of the sentence as it is here without that capitalization. It's been stated in another lesson, but if you have a quotation that is interrupted by the attribution of who's saying the quotation and then continued, that continuation, that first letter is not capitalized. Okay, quotations within quotations. You'll use a single quotation marks to indicate a quotation within a quotation. So Mark said, "My teacher told me that Ben Franklin once said, 'Any fool can criticize, condemn, and complain.'" I wonder if he was trying to drop a hint. So there's a larger quotation here, what Mark is saying, but Mark is quoting Ben Franklin, and so that is set off just with single quotation marks. That is a quotation within a quotation. Uncommon or colloquial expressions. Sometimes quotation marks are used to indicate a phrase that someone else uses, not what the author would normally use, and so quotation marks will be put around it as if to say, I'm not the one who used this word or said it quite like this. Sometimes they're called scare quotes or sneer quotes. Sometimes they can be used kind of mockingly, saying like, can you believe that someone would say it like this? Or sometimes it doesn't have that sneering. Sometimes it's just indicating that it might even be charming that somebody used a certain word, as in this example. My daughter gave me a handful of weeds and told me to put these flowers in water so they wouldn't die. Flowers there in quotation marks. It's a way of kind of winking at it and saying, I understand that that's not the right word to use. Titles of short works. So you place quotation marks around the titles of short works, such as poems, short stories, articles, songs, and TV programs. Remember, book titles are italicized, but with titles of short works, you put quotation marks around them. So in English 101, we read George Orwell's Shooting an Elephant. I find the story A Rose for Emily quite disturbing, and so on. Okay, quotation marks with other punctuation. With commas, you want to place commas and periods inside quotation marks. So, I can't accept your apology, she said. So you can see how the comma there is within the quotation marks. And then the second one, Einstein once said that imagination is more important than knowledge. The period there is within the quotation marks. That's a common mistake. Sometimes writers will put that end punctuation outside the quotation, but that's not so unless that punctuation mark belongs to the original quotation, especially we're talking about question marks and exclamation points. So if we have, he looked at me and said, "Do you have a problem?" In that case, the original quote is a question, and so the question mark still goes inside the quotation marks. But in the second example, "Can you believe Einstein said imagination is more important than knowledge?" That is the original quotation, "Imagination is more important than knowledge," is not a question. The writer turned this into a question, is asking a question about the quotation. So in that case, the question mark goes outside of the quotation marks. Okay, and so here's some tips on using quotations within a writing project. There are whole guides about how to properly cite quotations used in work. There's APA, MLA, Chicago manual style. So I'm not going to go into those, but if you're doing an academic writing project, you do need to find out what style is being required and cite the sources and use the quotations in the format that is required by that particular style, whether it's MLA or APA or whatever. But there is some general principles here that we can talk about, such as integrating quotations. So in academic writing, you never plop a quotation in the middle of your writing without properly introducing it and then following it with more commentary and explanation. So there's some guidelines here. First, you set up the context for the quote and introduce the author, usually, and then you follow the quote with additional or related commentary. So let's look at an example that does not do that. So this is an incorrect example here. In this paper, I will explore attitudes towards nature in ancient times. 44 of the 66 meanings of nature listed by Arthur Lovejoy and George Boas were already current in classical times. Ancient Greeks and Romans had a sophisticated concept of the meaning of nature. Okay, this has the problem that the first line doesn't say anything about here comes a quotation or here comes some research. It just sort of all of a sudden appears. And then the paper moves on without really pointing back to that or explaining that quotation or talking about its significance. So here is the better version, and we'll go through line by line and see how and why it is better. So first we have the first line kind of sets up the context of the quote. We know what we're talking about. This line introduces the work and the author. And it's kind of a way of saying, here comes a quote. And then the last line here, those definitions, however, had little to do with modern ideas of finding enjoyment in unspoiled wilderness. So we have the introduction to the quote, the lead in there, the quote itself, and then this line kind of pointing back to the quote, giving more information or explaining it, tying it back into the body of the essay. Also, a thing with integrating quotations in a paper is the first time an author is mentioned, you use the first and last names, and after that use the last name only. So when a first mention, it would be according to John Smith. Later on in the paper, you just say Smith argues that. You just use the last name there. And one more tip. You want to avoid connect the quotes essays. When you are using sources and are integrating quotations into your work, you don't want to overdo it. The amount of quotations should never outweigh your own content. In fact, your own content should far outweigh the content of whatever quotations you are using. Connect the quotes is just having a bunch of quotes in there, a little bit of commentary in between each one, and that's not going to be acceptable for most assignments. Okay, that's all for quotation marks and just a little bit of advice for the use of quotations in writing, especially academic writing.